what I believe God has for this generation and for this time. A lot of relevant information, hopefully, to help you as you go out into the world. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you to Allie for inviting me here today. I was really excited. I'd never heard about desert apologetics, but then I would have to be online or connected to the world. And I have 3 boys, and they all play sports, and so I have no life. So I am completely involved with them, but I'm really excited to be here. So I'm going to start off with a story, and it's actually a true account. In 1938, there was a radio broadcast, and this broadcasting was kind of revolutionary, and they were sending out this message across the airways in the United States. And remember, at the time in 1938, the radio was the primary means of communication. They didn't have the internet, they didn't have Google, they couldn't tweet information. And so there was this radio broadcast, and there was this one particular evening, everyone was sitting around listening to the radio. And the bulletin began, and it began like this. It said, "We would like to interrupt your regularly scheduled program because we have an urgent news bulletin." And this urgent bulletin continued, "We have an urgent news bulletin to report a major event. A meteor has hit the earth." Now imagine sitting and listening to this. And they said, "A farmer's field in Grover's, New Jersey has been struck with a meteor." I repeat, farmer's field, Grover's, New Jersey, meteor. We don't know what this meteor is. We don't know what's going on, but we have someone out there who's going to let us know what's going on. And then it changed, and this frantic announcer got on, and a reporter live from the site, he said, in the shaky voice, ladies and gentlemen, I have some kind of urgent news to tell you. I'm standing here, and something has hit the earth, and we don't know what it is. We don't know what it is. Oh my goodness, ladies and gentlemen, it's opening. It's opening up. Now, as they sat and heard this, the only source of information was what they were hearing. They could not verify whether or not this story was true or not. And the broadcast continued. And he yelled, "Something is going on, something is going on. Something has landed on the earth, and it is opening up." And this radio announcement caused such a panic, and people began to be so upset that they began running out, literally running out in the streets, talking to their neighbors. "Did you hear what's going on? Did you hear it? A meteor just hit the earth. It's opening up." And the broadcast continued. He said, "We think that the army is now being deployed." And they said, yes. "We see the army. It's coming in. They're arriving on the scene." And all of a sudden, what people started to do was it created a panic amongst this community. And so they called the police station. And the police station began to be flooded with frantic calls. People crying, people scared, people not knowing what should they do. How do they respond to this situation? And then another voice came on the radio. And he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to apologize. My name is Orson Welles, and I thought I made this clear at the beginning of this broadcast, but since there's such a panic, let me explain. We are reenacting a book by H.G. Wells called War of the Worlds. This broadcast, sorry, ladies and gentlemen, has been a media stunt to prepare for the opening of our new movie, War of the Worlds." Could you imagine? Could you imagine how angry everyone would have been? Probably lost ticket sales, maybe a few. But imagine the sense of shock, relief, and utter annoyance from the audience who began to react to the news that they heard. People were reacting to their perceived notion of truth. Make sure. To their perceived notion of truth. But there was, in fact, no war. Their perception of reality was shaped by this publicity stint, but they were deceived. They were fooled. They thought there was a war, but they were told, go back home. Nothing is going on. The way that you thought the world looked and worked is in fact wrong. Because the way that we perceive reality affects the way that we live in the world. How we have our perceptions, how should our perceptions about the world and about the state of affairs, they affect the way we conduct ourselves in our everyday lives. And isn't this the most important question that we have? Isn't this the most important question? Are my worldview commitments consistent with reality? After all, no one wants to get it wrong. We don't want to find out at the end that we were actually deceived and that we got it wrong. So the question we have to ask ourselves, is there really a war? I want to hit 3 points today. That there is a war against our reasoning. There is a war against our children, and there is a war against God. 1 Thessalonians. It says, finally, brethren, we urge and exhort you in the Lord Jesus that you should abound more and more, just as you receive from us how you ought to walk and to please God. For you know what commandments we gave you through the Lord Jesus. For this is the will of God, your sanctification, that you should abstain from sexual immorality, that each of you should know how to possess his own vessel in sanctification and in honor, not in passion of lust like the Gentiles who do not know God. So the way that we act reflects whether or not we know God. It is our duty to defend a purity ethic. So first, now I know what you're thinking, okay? You're thinking, okay, when I say defend, what do I actually mean? What am I saying? Am I implying that there is a purity ethic? Am I stating that morality, that purity is a moral value that supersedes my subjective opinion? We are living in a time when there is unfettered access to information. And yet, with all of our knowledge, we actually fail to produce wise actions. Youth do not know how to reasonably confront conflicting worldviews, nor do they understand how to form a cohesive worldview that accurately accounts for the existence of the world, for the existence of morality, and for the existence of God. According to Pew Research, youth spend an average of 9 hours a day online. 9 hours. So what do we do? What is our charge? And I think the first charge is we can go right to Scripture. In Acts 8, there was an Ethiopian eunuch, and he was sitting in his chariot. I'm sure you know this account. And as he was sitting, he was reading from the book of Isaiah. And up walks Philip, and Philip approached him. And I love this exchange because Philip said to him, do you understand what you're reading? And I love how he answered. He said, how can I understand if no one teaches me? How will they know if we don't teach them? But in order to teach them, we must be equipped. So before we even begin to look at the biblical passages about purity, the question is, do we even have the right to suggest that a purity ethic is an objective moral value? Because I don't want to just have correct views when I walk in the church. I want to make sure that the things that I believe about the world are consistent when I walk outside in the world. So how can we make sure that defending a purity ethic can stand the attacks in the secular square? An objective moral value is a value that is not decided by me, the subject, but rather a value that seems to have weight. An objective moral value has like an ought. It has an appeal. It's compelling me to do something. An objective moral value has weight. Now you may be thinking at this point, I know you have kids, you haven't seen the news, you don't know, nobody agrees. Everybody has their own values. Everybody has their own opinions. And it seems as if there is no way to adjudicate between values and decide if which value should be adopted and which should be rejected. And because of this tension between values, we often concede the conversation. We say the existence of conflict means that there can be no resolution. The existence of conflict between moral values is itself evidence that we need to get it right. So, are there moral values? Or are moral values something like preferences, just things that we like? Preferences like you'll see on the screen, the difference between Twizzlers and Red Vines. Depends which one you like. Some people like Twizzlers, some people like Red Vines. Are preferences like things like Panda Express or what is that other one? P.F. Chang's. Depends which one you like and what kind of budget you're on. Or our preferences, things like, and you see the big slide, chocolate. So I put chocolate and chocolate because there is no other thing. Chocolate is the best. So that's the right answer. If you didn't get that, we can pray afterwards. But there is nothing else to compare with chocolate. I saw this thing that said chocolate is God's apology for broccoli. But what it really is, chocolate is God's apology for kale, okay? And listen, let me tell you, don't come up to me afterwards and go, no, Lineage, we have this great kale recipe. No, okay? No, okay? It's disgusting, it's dirt, and I don't want it. And I don't even want to hear, sorry, this is a side thing. I don't even want to hear like that kale will help you live longer. That's okay, absent from the body, present with the Lord, I'm out. Don't want kale, okay? Sorry, okay, focus, yes. So, is objective morality something like preferences, or is it something else? So is objective morality nothing but a fancy word for preferences? And furthermore, what does objective moral values have to do with the existence of God and a purity ethic? So let's do kind of a case study. I don't know if you remember back in 2017, it was #MeToo. And this movement was started by Tarana Burke, and she was a social activist and organizer, and she actually started using this phrase in 2006. And then Alyssa Milano began to spread the phrase on Twitter. And she encouraged victims of sexual harassment to tweet about it, give them a sense of magnitude of the problem, give themselves a voice. So the Me Too movement became a voice for those who had experienced sexual harassment. And then all of a sudden, the doorway opened for everyone that had ever sexually harassed a woman. They were now being prosecuted. They were now being confronted. Now, let me be clear. I'm not evaluating the intentions nor the merit of such a movement. That's not the discussion. The question we have to ask ourselves is why do these types of movements have universal appeal? Why do movements exist in the first place? Movements thrive and have universal appeal because of belief and acceptance of objective moral truths. They have universal appeal that surpasses your individual preference. The existence of objective moral values allows us to adjudicate between moral reformers and moral reprobates. If objective morality did not exist, we could not have a discussion about the lessons that could be learned from Mother Teresa and Hitler. They would be the same. You would be in no moral position to say either of these people did anything good or anything bad. They just were. We could not even have a dialogue. And in fact, no society that has ever existed or that will exist actually concedes that there are no objective moral values. And every society that has ever existed, killing babies for fun, notice the caveat, for fun is wrong. But does that mean that God needs to exist? And the answer is yes. Why? Because objective moral values are laws that govern behavior. They decide what's right and wrong, what is good and bad, and these laws are essential for community. Now remember that, because I'm going to talk about how these laws affect our community. There was no ethical relativism when it came to the Me Too movement. This movement presupposed an ought. That there is a way that we ought to live. There is a way that you ought to treat women. And this is a statement of morality because it prescribes ethical norms for behavior. It prescribes, just like you go to the doctor and they prescribe you a medication in order to be fixed, in order to get well. Ethical norms, ethical morality, it prescribes norms for how you ought to live. Morality is objective. As Joel says, it's the plumb line for the measurement that remains outside of my particular preference. I like how C.S. Lewis says it. He says, the moment you say that one set of moral ideas can be better than another, you are in fact measuring them both by a standard, saying that one of them conforms to the standard more nearly than the other. But the standard that measures two things is something different from either. You are, in fact, comparing them both with some real morality, admitting that there is, my paper come up, that there is such a thing as the real and right, independent of what people think, and that some people's ideas get nearer to others to that real, right. And if you disagree, hold on, let me come back to the real or right. So that standard, that measurement is in fact God. In other words, we can put it like this if we want to kind of understand the moral argument for the existence of God. Number one, if God did not exist, objective moral values would not exist. Objective moral values do exist. Therefore, God exists. If there is no God, there can be no objective standard of right and wrong. And this concept of morality loses all meaning in a universe without God, as William Lane Craig says. This deductive reasoning, so when we look at these different types of argument, this is part of a cumulative case for the existence of God. So this is one argument weighed against all of the arguments that prove that God exists. And so we know we are justified in believing in God. And we are justified in saying that there is a way that we ought to live. And I haven't quoted a scripture for the justification. We have talked about how objective moral values affect how we live and affect how we're able to look at different moral reformers. And so now we have a duty to obey God. Belief in God is not just enough. Belief in God is not just enough. In the book of James, it says, even the demons believe in God, and they shudder. And I think that is so interesting because their belief in God causes them to actually have a physical response. It reminds me of The Lion King. All of my references are Disney movies, sorry. But it reminds me of The Lion King. And I don't know if you remember when the hyenas were looking for Simba and they were out, and one of the hyenas said, Mufasa. And the one hyena said, ooh. And they said, say it again, do it one time. Mufasa, ooh. That's what I think about when we think about that the demons shudder at the reality of God. So the question is, does the reality of God even cause us to shudder? Does it even cause us to have any type of response? Does it cause us to want to change our behavior? Does it cause us to want to obey him? John 14:15. He says, if you love me, you keep my commandments. The evidence of my love for God is demonstrated in the way that I behave and the things that I do. Because if you don't believe in God, if God does not exist, then you could actually behave like Jeffrey Dahmer. I don't know if you remember who Jeffrey Dahmer was, but he was the gentleman that ate about 17 young boys and cut them up and had them in his freezer and did major atrocities. And here's what Jeffrey Dahmer said. He said, if a person doesn't think there is a God to be accountable to, then what is the point of trying to modify your behavior to keep it within the acceptable range? That's how I thought anyway, he says. I always believed the theory of evolution as truth, that we all just came from slime. And when we died, that's it. There's nothing else left. Slime plus grime over time does not produce ethical behavior. If you don't believe in God, you're nothing more than an accident of evolutionary biological processes. Then any boundaries, any fetters to keep you in line are absurd. In fact, you actually begin to adopt the slogan from the Church of Satan. And the slogan from the Church of Satan is, do what thou wilt. And what's scary is, we can look at a lot of Christians and say, what church you go to? Because Jesus said, not my will be done, but thy will be done. This is a war. I remember back many years ago, and back in the 90s, before I was married, I was working with Title V. Title V was a abstinence funding that they were giving organizations, and it was the ABLE organization in Los Angeles. And we just received funding, and we were going into all of the LAUSD unified school districts. And we would go in, and we are teaching abstinence education. I could go on forever and talk about the amount of pushback we got. But because of that process, we had to be trained. We had to sit with nurses. We had to be trained on and get certified for STDs and STIs. And we had to learn how to communicate all this information in the school systems. And it was really an amazing process. But I'll never forget one time after we'd done skits and games and examples and given stories and talked about the rate of sexually transmitted diseases, a young man stood up in the back and he said, okay, I've heard everything you said, but why? And I was like, what do you mean, but why? We just said, we've been up here dancing and sweating and what do you mean, but why? He was like, I heard you. But why? Why should I do this? Why should I really, outside of the consequences, he hadn't experienced any of those yet. It was at that moment that I decided I need to be trained. Because I wanted to make sure that I was equipped to answer his but why. And not just equipped to answer his but why. How can I answer his but why and not quote a scripture? How can I lead him to the reality of God? How can I have a conversation with him? How can I get him to Jesus? If I had talked to him now, I would share different stories with him and I would be able to expound on different examples. But because he hadn't experienced it, I remember one time after I was married, and I thought about this years later, about this young man. And my husband played professional basketball for 13 some odd years overseas. And we were in a country, only Americans. And what happens when you're overseas living, all of the Americans tend to congregate together because you're glad someone else speaks your language. And so we were in this other country, and there were female athletes that were playing basketball and the male athletes that were playing basketball, and we were a family or a tight-knit unit. And one of the female athletes, I talked to her, and she had a boyfriend overseas, and she was a Christian and loved the Lord, so she said, and all these things. I was like, oh, great, we have something in common, and I'm a newlywed, and everything is fun. I'm happy about everything, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter that my parents are completely terrified because I'm in some random country. I won't say which one. And so we all, got really close. Well, soon after being overseas, she started to date one of the other basketball players. And I said, wait a minute, I thought you had someone overseas. Oh, yes, but Laneige, he loves me. Who? He loves you? He loves me. We're going to get married. I was like, wow, we just got here and you're going to get married. She was like, yes. I said, are you having sex with him? Oh, Laneige. I was like, what? You are? She was like, Laneige, you don't understand. We're in love. When we go back to the States, he's going to buy me a house. I said, next to which of his kids? Because he had like 5 kids. And I was like, so you're going to live? Yes. And you don't know, like, this is real love, and this is what God has for me. I said, oh, okay, hold on. God has for you to disobey God so that you can find who God sent you? And she was like, you don't know. This is the right one. You guys did it that way, but trust me, this is it. I was like, okay. It was one morning. It was early in the morning, and my husband had left to go to practice, and I got a knock on the door. And she knocked on the door, and it was way early. I had no makeup or hair on. I don't think I had anything. And she knocked on the door, and she came in, and she's full makeup and like hair done, like looking really nice. And I looked at her, and I said, good morning. I'm not up yet. What are you doing? It's early. And I could see when I looked at her through her makeup that her eyes were watering. And I said, what happened? What happened? Come in. And I'll never forget this because she knew that I was teaching abstinence education. She knew this is what I was about. And so she walked in, and she walked like this. And I'm looking at her going, did you pull something? Did you get hurt in the game last night? What happened? And she said, Laneige, this morning I was in the shower, and I have a really bad breakout. And me, oblivious, you have a bad breakout? She's like, I have a bad breakout. I was like, oh, what happened? And I said, well, how did this happen? Did you talk to him? And her eyes, the tears began to roll down her eyes. And she said, I did. And so first thing I had to find out was that she had herpes, I'll tell you that. But also having herpes, I don't know if you've traveled, but being sick overseas, and especially in male-dominated cultures, is a little bit different. And they don't speak English. So she had to go to the doctor with her translator to tell the doctor what was wrong with her. And so I said, I am so sorry. Did you tell him? And she began to break down and weep. And she said, I did. What did he say? He said, I didn't know it could show up that fast. But he loves her. And he gave her $200 and went to practice. They didn't get married. They each went back to their own state. She had to tell her boyfriend. Because we forget God is not giving us these norms of behavior to keep us from something. We have to remember that the enemy comes to kill, steal, and destroy. Because there is a war. William Lane Craig says it like this. He said, modern man thought that when he had gotten rid of God, he had freed himself from all the things that have repressed and stifled him. Instead, he discovered that in killing God, he also killed himself. For if there is no God, then man's life becomes utterly absurd. And yet we live within a system that is trying to obliterate any semblance of morality. And the springboard for these ideals is in the classroom. The truth of this statement is being played out in our communities and in our schools. There is a war against our children. And unfortunately, our classrooms have been the breeding ground for secular ideologies. From preschool to high school, secular educators are filling young minds with false ideas. And as Christians, we have let secularism invade the mind of our youth and shape their moral framework. This apathy on our part has begun to burst at the seams and is opening the door for moral confusion and ethical chaos. And this has never been seen more than when AB 32, comprehensive sexual education. So if you don't know what this is, comprehensive sexual education is an aggressive agenda that determines how children and youth understand their sexuality and that of their peers. And so you saw my papers fall. I know you're wondering, why does she have so much stuff up there? It's because I brought evidence. Sorry, philosopher, we have to have evidence. So, in the proposed Board of Education, comprehensive sexual education, what does it mean? How does the state of California begin to define what sexual education is and what they want to do in the schools? Well, first of all, they say, what does it mean to provide sexual education to children and youth? What type of information is provided and why? What goals do parents, caregivers, and professionals have when they teach children and youth about human sexuality? Sexual education should encompass many things. It should not just mean providing information about the basic facts of life, reproduction, and sexual intercourse. Comprehensive sexuality education addresses biological, sociocultural, psychological, and spiritual dimensions of sexuality. Spiritual. And I printed all this stuff up for you to look at. This is not what this is what is in their handbook. Spiritual dimensions of sexuality. The goal of comprehensive sexuality, the guidelines continue to state that sexual education gives young people an opportunity to question, explore, and assess attitudes, values, insights about human sexuality. The goals of this exploration are to help young people understand. Okay, the goal of comprehensive sexual education is to help young people understand family, religion, culture, and help them develop their own values, increase self-esteem, and develop insights about relationships with members of both genders, and understand their responsibility. Now, as a former educator in the school system, I'm sorry, I thought comprehensive sexual education would cover biology and the functioning of the body. But they said their goal is to help us develop values. But this is the problem. What values? Whose values? The goal is to help young people understand beliefs of others. In contrast to those, they need to develop their own values apart from the values of their own parents. And that is repeated constantly and consistently throughout the curriculum and the standards by the state, is that youth have the right to question the values of the parents that are raising them, nurturing them, love them. Now, if I didn't feed my child, well, they would mob, but my boys eat a lot. But if I didn't feed my child, the state would come in and say, wait, come on, you have a responsibility here. But when I begin to raise and instill certain values, the state now tells my child they have a right to question my values. We absolutely need to create a dialogue for sexuality that discusses morality, ethics, and personal responsibilities. But values and moral decisions apart from belief in God is a futile venture. Values are essential for total development of our youth, but our current educational system does not support our values. And so perhaps this discussion on comprehensive sexual education is outside the scope and capacity of the educational institutions. And part of this talk is what I did when I spoke at the school board in the desert at Indio. because I don't even have children in the public school system. I'm lucky enough, my husband works at a private school, Desert Christian Academy. So we're privileged to be able to put our kids to have Christian education. But my concern is not just for my kids. The Bible says that we are to take care of the widows, the orphans, and those that have no voice. Our responsibility is to be engaged within the community and to speak up for others who don't necessarily know how to articulate how we need to begin to engage in this culture. Now, I know what you're saying, okay? You're saying I'm exaggerating. You're like, okay, relax. It's not that bad. They just want to teach them sex ed. Oh, precious. In kindergarten, they want to teach. Sorry, I just lost my page. 10, 11. In kindergarten, there's a document called the Transitional Kindergarten through grade 3. And this is from the Health Education Framework, and you can go to this website. And here is what they say. Students also learn about individual differences, including gender, from an early age. Gender socialization begins before children start schools. Students may believe that different norms are associated with people of particular genders by the time they enter kindergarten. While this understanding may be limited, students can still begin to challenge gender stereotypes in a way that is age appropriate. Now, they just said they may not even understand, but with their lack of understanding, they can then be able to articulate a challenge and something they don't even understand at kindergarten. I have 3 boys. Maybe they're a little slower, but listen, I was like, you have 2 feet, okay? Don't walk on mine. That's what we were working through. Now, while students may not fully understand the concepts of gender expression and identity, some children in kindergarten and even younger, have identified as transgender or understand that they have a gender identity that is different from their sex assigned at birth. And then I think this line is so great. The goal is not to cause confusion. Really? I'm confused about the gender of a child, but develop awareness that other expressions exist. So still maybe you say, okay, but they're not really going to say it as the way that you think. So this is a book called Dry Humping Saves Lives. This is part of the curriculum. Sorry. I should have warned you. Sorry. You get riled up about, sorry. It gets a little deep right now. This is the curriculum. Now this is like you think, oh my goodness, how did you find that? You must have like dug for hours. No, you click down and it's right on their website. Dry Humping Saves Lives, a revolutionary sexual health guide for youth. And here is the gender gummy. And at the bottom, I don't know if you can read it. It says, but map out your gender gummy on the next page. No one's gummy is identical, and yours can change by day, by hour, or by minute. And then the curriculum continues, and it says phone sex, text, flirting, erotic text messaging. Whatever you want to call it, text messages can play a huge role in relationships. And then it explores the ways that you text message. Further within the curriculum, it gives you places to make out where you can, excuse the term, dry hump. And my mom is here, so sorry, Mommy, I'm saying those yucky words. I'm kind of embarrassed. Where you can make out at other places. And then the list is so extensive, they have the nerve to say, check off each place, complete them all. We are in a war. Or perhaps you can look at the #1 book that is the top of the California Education recommended book for young people to read. Now, you'll be happy it's just cartoons. But these cartoons were so pornographic that when it arrived, because I don't believe people, I have to check stuff out for myself when I hear it, that when it arrived and I began to look at it, my son ran and I was like, no, get away. I had to hide this book because I don't want them to find this. Because it's so sexually explicit and vile and perverted. We are in a war. Now let's clarify, because I know what you're thinking. You say yes, but with comprehensive sexual education, parents can opt out. Parents can decide, the schools have to notify you, and then you don't have to have your child in the classes. And you're thinking, you're freaking out over nothing, we're fine. And if this is what you think, you're wrong. In the LGBTQ inclusive parental opt-out, it says California law has also affirmatively requires schools to include instruction on LGBTQ people in history and social sciences. And so the question is, what is it? So you'll see a slide there, and of course I have the curriculum here. It's called the Two-Spirit People. And I'll let them tell you what they are about. This is only a few seconds.
We were considered two-spirit people, which means that we're all special because within us we have the male and the female, and that gives us a special way to look at the world and to see how things are happening. So it's important, I think, for gay people to look at that tradition of being two-spirit people. You're not less than other people, you're more than other people, yes, and have a deeper understanding of the whole picture.
The word Bardash is actually originally from a Persian term that comes out of what is now present-day Iran. And it was a term for catamite, a male.
Now, I won't play this whole thing. But the Two-Spirit video is on the recommended sources for curricula for elementary, 4th grade. And they outline, identify if you are a two-spirit person. And you notice they said that two-spirit people are better than other people. That to have the existence of the male and the female within you, you are actually a higher order person because you have the lens in which you can see and perceive the world better than people that just identify as a male or a female. This teaching is not just about adopting a lifestyle. This is a spiritual lesson about the metaphysical reality of two souls indwelling one body. This distinction of two raises broader questions regarding identity and the soul, and these questions about the existence of the soul. And it's not just about being one or the other, it's the elimination of gender identity. And more importantly, these topics are not being brought within the context of someone in their 20s or 30s sitting in a master's program of philosophy or sociology or psychology or whatever the science you're studying. These concepts are being introduced to young, impressionable minds that are not able to adjudicate what's right and wrong. And what child doesn't want to be more, better, see the world correctly? And instead, schools are not asking questions, they are assuming the answers to the questions. And they are indoctrinating our children in a normative fashion. Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage, How the transgender craze is seducing our daughters. This book was so disturbing that at times I had to stop reading because it made me so sad at the state of affairs. One of the things that I got from this book is she said the new idea is that lesbians no longer exist. Girls with more masculine presentation are really boys. This is not about gender identity. This is about gender erasure. Abigail describes the push, in fact, the shoving of adolescent girls who are learning how to navigate the onset of hormones and emotions and everything. And because you're kind of having that angst in their youth, they are being pushed towards transgender ideation. The goal is not to increase attraction between girls. The aim is to remove the female and leave only the male. Young girls are told that your parents' objection to hormonal treatment at age 12 is homophobic. And what is crazy is that many of the parents and the stories that she was telling within her book, these people weren't even necessarily Christians, nor were they necessarily even against their daughters being homosexual. They just didn't want their daughters at age 12 to begin hormone treatments that would affect their bodies for the rest of their lives. And Planned Parenthood is already offering free testosterone hormone treatment within the school systems without parental consent. Young girls are already engaging what is called top surgery. They are removing their breasts. She goes on in her book to talk about rapid onset gender dysphoria. That's what Dr. Littman calls this. And she tells you why children aren't speaking to their parents, why they become distant and angry, and why parents are clueless about the attack that is happening within their own homes. And yet she continues in her research to state why gender dysphoria is wrong. And she goes on to talk about the research, and she says over 60% of young girls who have made this transformation regret it. And they are now doing what's called detransitioning. But how do you detransition when you've already removed the ability to feed your children? You've changed your body. You've changed your hormone treatment. She talked about one young girl who went under detransition, and she got a little bit better and began to look more feminine, but her voice never came back, so she always sounded like a man. Furthermore, in the research by Dr. Littman, it states that doctors agree that this is not a process that should be taken lightly. And yet in schools, they have voted to allow children at the age of 12 to undergo hormone suppression. These consequences are irreversible, from infertility to mutilation. And in fact, the U.S. National Library of Medicine, National Institute of Health, says that they should not be allowing children to make these decisions. And additionally, they say, one of the key factors that influences this gender dysphoria, get ready, parents, I have another bad word, phones, access to social media. Access to an unfettered amount of information, unfiltered, for 9 hours a day. These girls and boys are looking at TikTok videos, they're looking at Facebook posts, and they are listening to everyone give them information about how they should be justified and choosing to reject their families. Within my own family, my niece our cousin chose to ignore the instruction of her mom. And another family welcomed her with open arms. We will accept you and allow you to be the boy that you want to be. The research continued to say one of the protective factors in reducing sexual risk behaviors during adolescence is parental monitoring. Parents getting involved. And yet we have this comprehensive sexual education that is literally ignoring the science, that is ignoring the research, because there is an agenda. There is an agenda, and there is a motivation to sexualize our youth by any means necessary. Furthermore, in the agenda, they state that we know parents will want to rebel against this. And they say, I'm going to read exactly what they say. They say, conservative law firms and other interest groups continue to challenge the implementation of CHIA compliant curriculum, which ultimately forces health educators and school administrators to decide between a state mandate and addressing dissenting parents and communities. However, all education areas, including sexual education, hold equal. What they are saying is that we, in fact, know what's best. We have decided that parental opinion about the education of their children should take back seat to our agenda. There is a war against God. Dr. Martin Luther King said when he was writing in a student newspaper for Morehouse College, he said, education must enable one to sift and weigh evidence, to discern true from false, real from unreal, facts from fiction. King further said that the function of education, therefore, is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. And he said the most dangerous criminal may be the man gifted with reason, but no morals. This worldview is committed to indoctrinating our children and youth to become hypersexual. This narrative is dangerous because ultimately these commitments make claims about God and reality and the world. This is no longer an unbiased analysis of behavior. Instead, these curricula are normative claims that not only describe expression, rather, it prescribes a form of expression that elevates the embodiment of dualistic spirits as the most authentic and natural realization of human persons. This is the epitome of the lie from the pit of hell. This is a war against God. And God says we are called to destroy arguments and all arrogance raised against the knowledge of God. And we are to take every thought captive and bring it unto the obedience of Christ. We must be willing to speak up for our youth, speak up for our children, and for those who cannot speak up for themselves. But unfortunately, we have taken an attitude of the Croods. I don't know if you've seen Croods, another cartoon. But one of the philosophies of the Croods, the dad had this philosophy: never not be afraid. And so he was constantly keeping his children in the cave. Never not be afraid. So they were always afraid of everything. And we want to keep everybody encased. Just come here, stay in this corner, don't move, don't look outside, don't do anything. And we're afraid. We're afraid to tell the truth. We're afraid to stand alone. We're afraid we're not going to be liked. We're afraid we're going to be unpopular. And we're afraid we're going to be unpopular with our children. And we're afraid to make our children stand alone. I work in a K-12 school. And as a teacher, I will tell you, I am amazed at the amount of research that is available for the influence of phones and what phones do to children. And yet, everybody has a phone. And they're on their phone all the time. I am amazed when I talk to friends of mine. And I said, don't give them a phone yet. They're ninth grade. And my friend said, yes, Lineage, but you don't know. She'll be the only one without a phone. Let her be the only one. Teach her how to stand alone. Teach her how to be an individual. Teach her how to think. Teach her how to look you in the eye when she's speaking to you. And I wasn't listened to. And this girl was a national soccer player. The minute she got a phone, all of a sudden her clothes got tighter, her shirts got shorter, and she's into boys, and she was done playing soccer. God has not given you the spirit of timidity, but of power, and of love and a sound mind. We are advocates for truth in our personal lives, in our homes, and our churches. And as Elastigirl says from Incredibles, when her husband wasn't paying attention to her and there was chaos all around her, and she looked at her husband at the other end of the table, and she looked at him and she said, "Engage." It's time for us to engage. Thank you.